anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick, living in fear just next door to paranoia. Sir Francis Bacon said, "Nothing is terrible except fear itself." 300 years later, Thoreau wrote, "Nothing is so much to be feared as fear." 100 years later, Winston Churchill said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And today, Commander Rick says, scary stuff is really frightening. But it's also exciting. Why else do people pay $80 to be hurled into the abyss at the end of a bungee cord? But I want to talk about the deep fears, the things we're powerless to control: death, birth, fate, interest rates. We built civilization to control nature and to conquer our primeval fears. Cocooned in our cars and condos, we think we're safe from lions and tigers and bears. To remind us we're not, we invented horror stories. It began in 1818 with Frankenstein. Mary Shelley created horror fiction and science fiction single-handed. When movies appeared in the 1900s, one of the first features filmed was Frankenstein. And when comic books took off in the 50s, among the bestsellers were ghoulish comics like Tales from the Crypt. Yesterday, I talked to Archie Goodwin. Archie edited Vampirella for Warren Comics in the 60s. More recently, he developed Clive Barker's Hellraiser for Epic Comics, and now he's editing Batman for DC Comics. Well, the only company Archie hasn't worked for is Archie Comics. Anyway, I asked him about the role of fear in storytelling.
To a certain extent, it's a release, I think. You scare the reader, but it's a safe scare. They can always set the comic or the book down. They can turn off the TV. I see it as a form of release for them, of maybe focusing on a fictional fear to relieve them of their own genuine fears, and sometimes to relieve them of a life of tedium. Sometimes we lead very even, balanced, unemotional lives, so we go to an amusement park and scare the hell out of ourselves on a roller coaster, or we buy a Clive Barker book, or we pick up a horror comic and look at it, because to sort of get kind of the stimulation of the fear that you might not really press upon yourself, just leading your own life.
I always define the horror genre as being about two basic emotions in humankind, which is love and fear. Out of that you get sex and death, you get hate and desire. But basically, if you take love and fear as the two basic elements, all the good horror stories have one or both of those elements. Having said that, the love element could be somebody in love with a putrefying corpse. And the fear element could be the fear of being caught for the crimes you've committed.
Steve, with the billions of horror stories you've read while editing all your anthologies, which author used fear the best?
Probably one of the best examples of the use of fear in a horror novel, I think, is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It's a story, or a short novel, which really doesn't tell you anything about the horrific elements in the course of the narrative, but it will build upon the reader's sense of fear, and it's a cumulative effect. So when you start reading this story, you're reading what is basically a straightforward narrative, and it's what Shirley Jackson leaves out of the story that creates the element of fear. And there's this old argument about whether we should show the monster in movies and in books, or whether we should keep it off stage and only imply. And I'm a believer that both elements work depending on the type of work you're looking for. I think Clive Barker proved that in Books of Blood, whereas The Haunting of Hill House is a very good example where when the monster is left off the stage, in this case the ghost, the poltergeist, it works just as well.
Clive Barker's Books of Blood are graphic, gruesome, gory gutfests. For more subtle but equally terrifying tales, check out Alberto Mangel's Black Water anthologies, the moodiest, darkest, most soul-disturbing fiction from around the world. Alberto also assembled the Oxford Book of Canadian Ghost Stories. Some of these cross the line between horror and fantasy. Which reminds me, Canadian fantasy writer Tanya Huff is moving more into horror with Blood Price, a novel about vampires, and the sequel, Blood Trail, about werewolves of London, Ontario. Hi, Tanya, it's Commander Rick. I'm discussing fear this week. Why do we like to be scared?
Fear is like sex. She's putting pauses around that so you can end it out real easy if you have to.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll use it, but you better explain it to me.
Think of the reaction when you're in a situation that terrifies you. I mean, your palms sweat, your heart beat, your breath comes faster, you start to tremble. Now, what other equivalent sensation, like what else gives you those equivalent sensations? It's the same rush you get. Fear is very sexy. All right, it's not so much like sex, it's sexy. It's that little thrill and it's a safe thrill. That's the other thing, especially fear in literature. It's a very safe thrill. It's like going on a roller coaster. You know you're not going to die. If you really wanted to risk your life, you'd fly jet planes for a living. Well, it's the same sort of thing. It's the same sort of fear in literature is that safe thrill. It's like the roller coaster. If you really wanted to do something terribly frightening, you'd be out working for social services and facing people in tenement apartments who don't have jobs and no hope. It's a safe thrill, safe sex. Ooh, we could tie that in somewhere, couldn't we?
Take protection, a latex condom, and a silver bullet. Thanks, Tanya. Fear and sex, sex and fear. Of course, fear can last for hours, and fear happens mostly when you're alone. And, well, moving on. If we fear the unknown, the future, then perhaps science fiction addresses those fears. Certainly one of the reasons for Star Trek's popularity is its upbeat vision of the future. I mean, just the fact that there will be a future is kind of reassuring. If you like a little fear in your fiction, check out Ray Bradbury, Fred Saberhagen, or Bob Shaw. Shaw's Shadow of Heaven involves a future America laid waste by germ warfare and a hero who suffers from agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces. I wish. And in The Ragged Astronauts, two planets circling each other share a very deep atmosphere, like two eggs in a frying pan whose whites have melted together. Prince Ledravor attempts an interplanetary voyage between them in a hot air balloon, despite his fear of heights. Last summer, I asked Bob Shaw why he was so intrigued with fear.
It is a good dramatic device. If you want to get an interesting story, a good plan is to put your central characters in this situation where they're terribly afraid of something, and see how they react to it. And I've been plagued with most of my life with a very, very strong phobia about blindness. I don't know how I got it. I think it perhaps began during the Second World War when we had total blackout, and I had to go to bed at night and my mother closed the door and the room was in total blackness. And for some reason it got to me. And quite a few of my books have reflected this thing. And it was complicated by the fact that about 20 years ago, I got an eye disease which seriously threatened my sight. And some people are very brave about going blind, but I'm quite certain I would kill myself if it happened to me. I just couldn't take it. As I said, if you put somebody, make them really afraid, then you're in a situation where where the writer can get full dramatic value out of it.